We are so happy that you are able to join for today's event. This event series is part of the Data Science for Social Impact Initiative, which is a collaboration between the Social Policy Institute, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance, and data.org. Special thanks to MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for making this event possible and for helping to advance the broader field. In addition, I would like to shout out to our amazing advisory committee, which includes local and national leaders in data for social impact. They have really helped to shape the initiative through its development, and we are really grateful for their participation and their guidance. At the Social Policy Institute, our vision is to reduce inequality in social, economic, health, and education outcomes through evidence-informed policy and practice. And we know data is a really big part of that. So we're not interested in data for data's sake, but we're really interested in thinking about how data can help us advocate for change in all of these areas. So to that end, the objective of the DSSI initiative is to create learning and connection among social sector organizations who are seeking to use data to increase their impact and promote equitable outcomes in all of these areas as well. So I'm excited to hear from our amazing speakers who are here today to share with you some of their expertise on what it means to engage community and mobilize data to advocate for change in education specifically. But first, I want to take a moment to share just a couple of events that are upcoming that are being hosted by the Social Policy Institute. So first, we have the future of building wealth, and I'm going to put this in the chat, research, policy, and action. And this is panel discussions that will feature contributors to the book, The Future of Building Wealth, alongside regional leaders who are putting these ideas into action. This is an in-person event. It's the first in-person event we've had in quite a while. And so we really look forward to people in the St. Louis region joining us for that. And then after that, November 15th, and I'll put this in the chat in just a moment, Data is for Everyone, a Data Science for Social Impact Summit. So this is really an opportunity. We've been having these learning events all year, and this is really an opportunity to get together and think about what comes next for this initiative and these conversations that we've been having about equity-centered data practice. This will be a day-long in-person event for those who are able to make it. We will also have opportunities for online participation for those who might be further away but still want to be a part of the conversation. So we have some incredible speakers already, and more will be announced soon. And we're going to get a sneak peek into the DSSI curriculum materials that we've been developing over the course of this year. And so that you can take these conversations and really take them to the next level and have some concrete things to take back to your organizations. So we will put that in the chat and be sure to sign up for that. And I'm now going to turn things over to Sarah Mohammed, one of our amazing collaborators from the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance, who will move us into the event.
Thanks, Jen Rose. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Mohammed, as Jen Rose said. I am the Associate Director of Engagement and Equity for the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance. I also serve as a Senior Advisor for the Data Science for Social Impact Initiative and a member of the Advisory Committee. You might have seen my picture on one of those previous slides. So today's event is the last in a series of learning events. And we have an amazing group of speakers who I'm really excited to hear from. So first, though, I would like to do a quick plug for our event survey. So Jen Rose is going to drop the link in the chat. So if you could go ahead and just pull that up in your browser, separate tab, and it'll be there waiting for you after the event, later in the day. Whenever you have a moment to fill it out, it's just there and you can go ahead and fill that out. We really do take your feedback to heart. So please do fill out the survey and let us know how we're doing. So for those of you who may be new to the initiative, this learning event series is based on a framework that was developed over the last 2 years with input from a wide range of social sector folks, including the advisory committee, as well as feedback from a series of public roundtables where we had over 200 participants representing over 100 organizations join in on the conversation. So you can see that framework on the slide there. And the framework includes 6 focus areas, and each month we hold an event that that zeroes in on one of the focus areas. So today that is engage stakeholders to translate findings into action. So what does this mean? This focus area is all about how social sector organizations mobilize data and engage community in order to advocate for change. So this involves asking questions like, what changes are we hoping to see, and how does data help us get there? Who do we need to engage in order to advocate for change? Grassroots groups, practitioners, policymakers, etc. And what kind of stories are we trying to tell? And what's the role of data in telling those stories? And how can we use data, both quantitative and qualitative, to reach hearts and minds when it comes to issues that we care about? So those are the questions that today's speakers are going to be answering and thinking about, particularly with regard to the issue of educational equity. So just a quick overview of how today is going to go. So first, we will hear from Karishma Furtado of Forward Through Ferguson and the Urban Institute. She's going to talk about data storytelling as a means to advocate for enduring systems change for racial equity, and in this case, racial equity in education. Then Charlie Cooksey will talk about her work with WePower, addressing inequities in early childhood education. Next, Sharita Love will share her work with the Education Equity Center of St. Louis and how they engage with school partners to address disparities in education in the St. Louis region. And finally, Joy Wiesmoll will talk about her work with the Keep Kids in Class Coalition to address racial disparities in school suspensions and disparate school discipline policies. And then at the end, we'll go ahead and open it up to a larger discussion where you'll be invited to share some of your thoughts and insights and strategies, questions with one another. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our first speaker. She's a founding staff member and director of data and research at Forward Through Ferguson and an equity scholar at the Urban Institute. Please welcome Karishma Furtado.
Thanks, Sarah. Let me get my screen sharing situated. Okay, people can see my screen. You can hear my voice. Perfect, perfect. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sarah and Jen Rose, for inviting me to be a part of this afternoon, and thank you to you all for sharing a bit of your day with me. To provide a little bit of context, when I started working with Jen Rose to design this event, as has been mentioned, a theme quickly emerged within the Engage umbrella, and that theme was really data strategy for advancing education equity. The incredible work that Sharita, Joy, and Charlie have been doing really immediately came to mind as Jen Rose encouraged me to start brainstorming. And then we all sat down virtually, and in telling our stories, Sharita, I think it was you that pointed out that we all had roots in the Ferguson Commission. And that I thought was such a beautiful realization, and one that I think is so relevant to the topic of this session. So often I think we use data to drive our strategy. We like to think that the data can tell us what must be done. And I think that's not just a belief held by data users and appreciators that I imagine all of us in attendance are. I think that it tends to go deeper, that we have a cultural value that tells us that data can point us to the truth. And no doubt about it, I think it can be a useful tool for that. But I think we might need to flip the script a bit and think more intentionally about how data is used to achieve a set of strategic aims. So data not necessarily as the driver, but as a tool in the service of strategy as a driver, and ideally justice and equity oriented strategy. So that I think is what we're going to talk about today, how one large, impossible seeming aim, namely achieving a racially equitable St. Louis through systems change, has fueled our separate but related work. And we're going to get to our individual efforts shortly, but including an example from 4 through Ferguson. But first, I wanted to tell you about the shared vision that drives us all. And along the way, I'll tell you a little bit of my story as a data wonk trying to find her role in creating a more equitable St. Louis and region and world, dare I say. So for some historical context, especially for those who may not be joining us from the St. Louis region, around midday on August 9th, 2014, 18-year-old Michael Brown Jr. was killed by police officer Darren Wilson on Canfield Drive in Ferguson, a municipality in North St. Louis County. Protests over his death began the next day, and before long, #Ferguson became international shorthand for the militarization of police response to mass demonstration, the brokenness of the justice system, the deep racial divides between community and law enforcement, and civil unrest because of all of the above. In response to this outcry, then Governor Jay Nixon created the Ferguson Commission through executive order. The commission's purpose was not to conduct a deep investigation of what happened that afternoon, that summer day, but rather to conduct a thorough, wide-ranging, and unflinching study of the social and economic conditions that impede progress, equality, and safety in the St. Louis region. At the time, I was a student in Washington University in St. Louis's Master of Public Health program, where I was studying the social determinants of health and system science, but not really in any way that meaningfully engaged with the way those things were playing out in my own community and just outside my classrooms. And I wanted to participate, but didn't see and still don't see myself necessarily as an organizer or an activist. But it turns out, as I am sure this resonates with many of those of you in the data space working in the social sciences, and social policy spaces, that sometimes the movement for social justice needs a good spreadsheet and some nice data management and information management. So I had the opportunity to work for the Ferguson Commission and did, and from there went on to help found 4 through Ferguson. And I found the prospect of working for the commission to be, in a word, really quite terrifying. And I was, and mostly still am, a numbers person. I like to sit behind a screen and work with relatively neat zeros and ones and handy models with quantified parameters and measures of fit. And the commission process was really shaping up to be very much by design anything but neat and tidy. Leaders of that process, Starsky Wilson, Bethany Johnson, Jeff Waugh, Rich McClure, and several others, were setting some steep table stakes. They wanted a process that was painfully open, that did not shy away from the pain and the outrage that so many Black St. Louisans felt. And so it began, those misgivings and that discomfort that I felt notwithstanding. I joined the process, and between November of 2014 and September of 2015, when the commission's report was released, we met about 70 times across an array of convening types, heard from about 80 different subject matter experts, and worked with over 100 working group participants, engaging all told with about 3,000 community members. All in all, the commission was a feat of community love, anger, and determination from commissioners, working group members, and other citizens who contributed over 30,000 hours of their time to try to create change, namely through the formulation of these 189 calls to action, policy-based calls to action, 47 of which were designated as particularly urgent, unflinching, and potentially transformational. And those were our signature priority calls to action. 4 through Ferguson emerged from the commission's report as a commitment to ensuring that the commission's calls to action and the community's work on those 189 policy calls would not gather dust on a shelf, and rather through FTF and its work in partnership with so many others, we could seek to catalyze the implementation of those calls to action in a way that was deeply community centered and accountable. And we live into that mission through these 3 action strategies for including advocating for policy and systems change, building racial equity capacity, and generating the capital needed to sustain the work and facilitate long-term change. All of which, combined with the right heart set for the work, we believe will allow us to achieve STL 2039, or a racially equitable St. Louis 25 years or 1 generation after the killing of Mike Brown. And one approach that we take to implementing our action strategies, especially in the policy and systems change space, is through data storytelling. Systems change, which is really our goal at Forward Through Ferguson, requires what social scientists call durable attitude change. That's a shift in attitudes that persists over time and is resilient to counterattacks. And that in turn requires more than just shifting people's minds. It requires really shifting their hearts, tapping not only into what people know is right in sort of a prefrontal cortex way, but as well as what they feel to be right in terms of their values, their hopes, the way they understand themselves and their family and their communities. Data storytelling is also how we remind ourselves not to fall into the inequitable practice of fixating on data and losing sight of the individuals who embody the data. So we tend to, whenever we build out our projects, think about what are the facts and the figures, the research, the analysis that we can bring to bear, and how can we uplift and center the individuals whose lived reality we're trying to summarize and synthesize with that research, with that analysis. And some of the ways in which we do that, we live into this philosophy of pressure and partnership. You see bulleted along the bottom here. We seek to catalyze and measure impact, facilitate accountability, deepen understanding, and imagine what's possible, all through this broader call to engage in data storytelling. And so with that grounding, teeing up FTF's work and the broader Ferguson Commission calls to action that I think the panelists and I see ourselves working in the service of, I'm not going to spend the last 5 or so minutes of my time introducing you to an example of how we at Forward Through Ferguson live into those principles of data storytelling and really heed the Commission's call to demonstrate how systems and structures drive inequities in our region, as opposed to some of the more interpersonal, individualized ways in which racism is often understood. This project, the Still Separate, Still Unequal project, was the product of years of working in the education space, including through partnerships with all the partner organizations that you'll hear from today. So years of trying to make change, experiencing some success and a good amount of spinning wheels, and years of hearing from colleagues and partners' experiences doing the same from their corners of the ecosystem. The idea at the heart of Still Separate, Still Unequal was this understanding that we are constantly reminded of the ways in which gaps exist on our educational landscape. We have countless examples of them: the achievement gap, the learning gap, the summer slide, the discipline gap. Our education landscape tends to be littered with the evidence of how Black students tend to perform worse than their white classmates. And these cracks tend to be so deep, so persistent, that they've become, I think, for many, permanent disfigurations on our education topography, despite many efforts to close them. The Still Separate, Still Unequal tool asserts that those past efforts largely failed because they didn't engage with the sources of the outcome disparities, the structure of our education system. And we further assert that our education system is doing exactly what it was built to do, affording better opportunities to white and wealthy students at the expense of poor and Black students. If I had more time with you, I would walk you through snapshots of what we found across the tool, which is organized in this sort of recursive, nested way. We start with the outcome disparities that capture so much of our attention and our headlines, and ask, well, why are those outcome disparities fairly predictable, so entrenched on our landscape, by first looking at the education environment that students in our region find themselves in, and how those education environments are systematically different for majority Black compared to majority white school districts. Then we ask ourselves, well, why is that the case? Why are education environments different? Well, that takes us to funding. How is funding different in majority white versus majority Black districts? And we find that there are systematic differences there as well, which prompts the question once again of why, which leads us upstream to property taxes. And the differences that we see in majority white, majority Black districts there finally prompts the question of how segregation is still active on our education landscape. So the tool is organized into those 4 interrelated structural barriers to racial equity in our education system that culminate to make those outcome disparities nearly inevitable. They're not intended to be all the structural barriers or a definitive explanation of the causal linkages between each, but really all told, the goal is to provide a call to see the system that produces the outcomes, and to see that at every step in the journey, we find systemic barriers to education equity. And with some historical analysis, some policy analysis to contextualize all of that, we seek to show that it is not an accident that the structures exist the way they exist, and that those structures make the outcome disparities, like I said earlier, rather inevitable. So again, can't really get into the data too much with the amount of time that we have together today, but would encourage you all to check out stillunequal.org if that topic is of interest to you. This is a slide, a phrase that we say often, a slide that I share often, that diagnosis determines treatment. I think it's so essential to how I think about the role of data in systems change. When we look at, in the context of this particular project, when we look at education disparities and we make a diagnosis about the individual failure of Black kids that aren't trying hard enough, or of parents that don't care, we develop one set of treatments that try to increase engagement, or that try to identify the kids who have exceptional potential or grit. But when we make a diagnosis of systems drivers that stack the deck against marginalized students, we come up with a whole different set of interventions. And I think that ability to prompt different questions and seed different conclusions is a unique strength of data, and when paired with storytelling, can really be a powerful way of shifting the conversation. But producing that analysis that I didn't really get to dig much into, but you'll have to trust me, it's there, or you can go check it out on stillunequal.org. Producing that analysis, running those numbers wasn't the end of the project. We were seeking to, again, use data to advance a set of strategic aims. So the bulk of the work was, after having completed those analyses, in many ways, just beginning. We'd been planning all along for this intensive dissemination strategy that acknowledged the different target audiences for the project and the different messages that they needed to hear, and the different channels through which they received information. So while the report exists, and I think is the place where a lot of the detail lives, it certainly is not the end of the story of this project. And you can even see on the title page here, it's considered a companion to the website where most of the dissemination efforts live, and very intentionally through David Dwight, the executive director at Forward Through Ferguson's encouragement, try to think of our data work as a set of tools, and not the report is not a static thing that lives on a website somewhere. It's really the starting point to a great deal of effort to engage people with the findings of those that work. So the report is one thing, but there are also individualized analyses for every school district in the region that you can find in the appendices. We also provide all the source data so that folks can dig into that if they have that level of interest. So for data wonks, for our school district leaders, for our superintendents and school board members who are interested in what's going on in their district, we provide that more granular perspective. We have a video that summarizes the tool and the findings in about 5 minutes or so, I want to say. It is really engaging and compelling, very visually attractive. We have data storytelling profiles of individuals from the region and outside the region, and how they lived some of the findings of the report, how those patterns show up in their own daily lives. We have infographics that speak to more of that NPR level of interest. And we have a large and growing library of presentations that we've made on the tool to an array of different audiences throughout the region, including the St. Louis County Library, lots of school districts, board meetings, funders, etc. So this, I think, is 95% of the work that has gone into Still Separate, Still Unequal, the work that seeks to bring it to life after the analyses are complete. I'm well over my time, so I'm going to quickly just run through some final thoughts. Data, first starting with the fact, I think you maybe know this, but it's always helpful to hear, I think, that data and data-minded folks have an important role to play in the fight for social justice. That being said, data is a tool, and we need to ask some key questions to ensure that we're using it effectively and equitably, starting with how does data fit into your theory of change? And it probably can't be the whole strategy. Just running some analyses and putting numbers out into the world isn't enough to ensure that those findings go on to do what you want them to do. To who are you developing your theory of change with? Probably can't do it alone. We each have a role to play in the efforts to advance social justice, and our efforts in the data space need to be informed by the perspectives of others on the landscape who are working more closely with the direct practitioners, the community members that are embodied in your data, et cetera. So we really need to work in lockstep with and in communication with those partners to inform our theory of change and the role of data within it. We need to know who our audiences are, what their informational needs are, what messages resonate, how they receive information, lots of questions related to that. And these tend to be questions that I, at least as a data person, don't naturally gravitate towards in terms of having easy answers. So I have to work closely with my strategic communications friends within my organization and outside to really build my muscle and encourage them to pressure test some of my thinking when I'm working on a data project. And then finally, how do you close the feedback loop once a project is out into the world and you see where it's experiencing traction, where it's experiencing some friction? You gather that information and how do you feed it into the next iteration of that particular project, as well as future projects. And I think that is my final slide. Here's my contact information if anyone wants to continue the conversation. Sarah, maybe I'll pause here and you can let me know how you want to use the time. I have a question that we can discuss, or if time is limited, we can move on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Karishma. You know what I think I will do? That was a fabulous presentation, and I'm just going to put this question in the chat for folks to think on, because we're going to have an opportunity later to really take this conversation, have this conversation together as a group. So a question that Karishma had posed before: how do you gather information about your target audiences? You know, how do you figure out what they believe, where they gather information, whose opinions they value? So something to think about as we move to the next speaker, who Okay. So yeah, things to think about in the chat as we move to the next speaker. And I just want to go ahead and move to the next speaker now, and we will discuss both of these in a little bit. So thank you, Karishma, for getting the conversation started and keep those questions coming in the chat. The next speaker is a former elected St. Louis School Board member and the founder of We Power, whose mission is to activate community power to redesign education, economic, health, and justice systems to be just and equitable for all. So please welcome Charlie Cooksey.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Happy first Monday of October. Happy fall, and thanks for allowing me to be with you all today. And also it's an honor to follow Karishma after having the pleasure of working with her for a few years on important work tied to racial equity, the Commission report, and education. So I'm going to spend my time with you all really diving into the way that we see power, early childhood, and systems change intersecting, and the role that we ideally all can play, particularly tied to the data, to really advance power building and systems change in the early childhood space. So first, what is We Power? Our mission is to train, activate, and support especially Black and Latinx folks to design equitable policies, to organize, to transform our education and economic systems, advancing those policies that have been designed, and then to build thriving businesses that can create wealth for our communities. And we at the core believe that power is a human right. However, social systems have strategically suppressed the power of everyday people. So our work is to activate what's already inside of each of us. And there's 4 ways that we do that. One is building authentic relationships between everyday people. So simply put, we're knocking on doors almost every day we can when it's warm enough. We're making phone calls, we're hosting community events just for community to be in relationship with one another, be in relationship with us, and ground ourselves in joy and healing. The second strategy, which I will really elaborate on today, is activating a movement of new leaders of all kinds, new community organizers, new system designers, and new public leaders who are working to reimagine systems and then build enough power to transform those systems. So right now we're focused on doing this tied to early childhood and our local economies. Our third strategy is to accelerate community-owned wealth generation. So simply put, we believe that entrepreneurship is one path, not the only path, but the path that we have chosen to use to create wealth at the local and neighborhood level, wealth that communities can self-determine to fund the movement of transforming their life outcomes. And then lastly, and similar to the work of Ferguson, we try to tell human-centered stories as much as possible that shift beliefs and behaviors. And so sometimes, most of the times, those are very narrative-based stories, and then sometimes they're trying to tell stories with data. And I'll talk a little more about one of those data tools that we're incubating at We Power and with partners at WashU. So our big vision, one of our big visions is that we increase the number, specifically the percentage of Black and Latinx children who have access to high quality, cost-effective early childhood seats birth through 5. So I'm going to transition to a quick activity. Oh, wait, that's already there. But hopefully it changes you all engage. So if you can go to pollev.com/STL005 and respond to this prompt. And I'll put it in the chat. pollev.com. So interesting to see the data. Whoa. All right, I'll give this a few more seconds. All right, feel free to keep voting, but I'm going to move us on. if folks can drop in the chat, like if you say you are power hungry, why? If you said you are not power hungry, why not? But there is a right answer. So why are you power hungry? Why aren't you power hungry? So it looks like we're split close to 50-50 right now. So for us, we define power simply as the ability to act, to be able to self-determine. So often we are conditioned based on these examples we're seeing in media and in society that power is a negative thing, but power actually at its basic level is neutral. What we do with it could be negative or positive, but that is based on how we use it. So we believe that power is an important thing, and we should unapologetically build that power. And we see it coming from three sources: organized people, organized money, and then positional power. So we believe that if we can organize these three things towards a shared vision, for example, a shared vision of how to transform early childhood, that is when we start to get closer to moving the needle on the system becoming more racially equitable. So this is just a quick reflection, but way too often we are taught to be afraid of our power. If we are, you can easily fill in that blank with so many identities. If we are Black, a woman, queer, a person of color, trans, Latinx, poor, immigrant, a care provider. But that is by design. And that we will start to see the needle move once we are recognizing our right and our responsibility to build and wield power, and especially in this case, not just for ourselves, for our babies. So the right answer to that question is we should all be power hungry, and I hope we leave here embracing the beauty of building power when it's for good and for transforming our early childhood system. So power towards what? For us, we are building power towards systems change. This is a really cool framework that comes from a article or publication called The Water of Systems Change. So often, we are conditioned to think that, like, if we just change the policies, the practices, if we just get more money in the system, everything will work out. But it's so much more nuanced than that. And so this framework introduces the concept that there are different types of conditions of systems change. And in the most transformational type of systems change condition is mental models. We have to shift our hearts and mindsets and beliefs in order for us to shift the relationship to connections, the power dynamics, which then set us up to shift policies, practices, and resource flows. So for example, we can shift a policy, but if we don't change our mental model around it, that policy might only get us so far in this sort of more comprehensive effort to shift the entire system. So here's a case study of how three sources of power are organized and then towards what end. So the National Rifle Association, not endorsed by We Power, but they have been able to organize approximately 5 million members. That has turned into about 128 million per year in organized money. And they have been able to influence over 300 federal campaigns and contribute 30 million to Trump's campaign. So because of these three sources of power organizing towards the shared vision of rifle rights, they have been able to achieve a lot at the federal level. So at We Power and with our partners, we are working our hardest to build power, to organize people, to organize money, to organize positional status towards a racially equitable early childhood system. So I'll talk more about how we do that now. So we have a lot of inspiration from the Ferguson Commission report and the process that really inform our design of what we call the playbook. But the playbook is a direct response to a report that was published, really a needs assessment called The First Step to Equity. And it showed all these gaps and barriers that are making it hard for our early childhood system to function. And that First Step to Equity report really was inspired by the Ferguson Commission report and the Ferguson Commission report calling on significant investment in early childhood. So the work that we do tied to early childhood, like I just said, it's a direct response to one of the commission's signature Youth at the Center calls to action, which is ensure sufficient early childhood development and education programs meet the demand and also align all efforts to be high quality and measurable outcomes. Back to that concept of, can we measure it? What does the data say beyond us just feeling better? So the playbook was designed by our 14 fellows. We call them Tomorrow Builders. They went through a 2-year process with WePower. They were early childhood educators, center directors, parents, elected leaders, academics, activists. We tried to recruit a really diverse mix of folks who were proximate to the issue. A majority of them identified as people of color, and we had some of our members identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. And they spent those 2 years, 1, better understanding the system, and then 2, reimagining and redesigning that system. So the playbook, it has 17 high-level actions and solutions that were all community authored, and they all have sub-solutions that further break down that high-level solution. It was designed not to just be a report, but to drive action over the next several years. The playbook is organized by 5 different areas. Each area, again, lots of lessons from the Ferguson Commission process. Each area has accountable bodies for each solution, outcomes, and indicators, because again, we want to measure shifts in the system, not just engage in a lot of activity. And it's really meant to foster collaboration and build off existing work, not be duplicative. And then the final part of the playbook has an implementation timeline to say it's not good enough to just say these are important solutions. We have to hold ourselves accountable for executing on these over the next few years. So in terms of the process, we started off with Tomorrow Builders Fellows meeting. Then they distributed a survey that was completed by over 1,000 community members across the region. And they also took learning trips with some of our key partners to other cities doing this work in a really inspiring and equitable way. Then we transitioned to design teams. So 5 design teams met 4 to 8 hours a day over several months. We had a design council of thought leaders and worked closely with other partners. And then to ensure that these are the right solutions, we had a community feedback event where we finalized those even more with impacted people and released the playbook the January of 2020. Some of our partners range from being on the solution team / design teams, the design council, and then the First Step to Equity Transitional Collaborative. And then we worked with tons of researchers and policy wonks. I'm going to skip this, but if we share slide decks, this is a cool video to watch. So just some of the challenges when listening to community, there were 5 buckets surface: governance and coordination, funding and access, quality, workforce, and family well-being. And so those are the 5 sections of the playbook. But just some stats, 58% of folks who responded to the survey said that low wages were a top barrier. They said that the cost and affordability of EC was a top barrier, and that educator quality and retention were a top barrier. I do want to cover this slide. So there's about 90,000 children birth through 5 in the region. Only about 47,000 have access to a seat. And then of those 47,000, only 5% in those childcare programs have access to accredited programs, which to me is criminal. Like, this is a crisis that we should all be investing in. And it takes collective action, but also data capacity. So we set a vision and values, and then solutions. So this slide I'll leave up here for like 1 minute, but these are the high level solutions for what we can do to address these root causes in the early childhood system. So there's anything from providing competitive wages and benefits to childcare educators, to establishing a governance structure or entity that does regional level coordination. And also thinking about the need to be holistic. One of the solutions that came out of it was like, we need to have more culturally responsive healthcare. The fact that the infant mortality rate, the harm that is done to Black mothers in the process of being pregnant, giving birth, have to be addressed as much as the efforts after a child is born. So here are some big wins we've accomplished since publishing that playbook in 2020. One is, I'm gonna go out of order, funding and access. So through radical collaboration, WePower and other partners won Prop R, which was a ballot measure to basically ensure that we have local dedicated public funding for early childhood. So we won that in 2020, and now 2.3 million per year is dedicated for early childhood in St. Louis City, which is this is the first time in the history of St. Louis we have local dedicated public funding. And that directly ties to one of the calls to action in the playbook. Another win is we've trained over 100, really close to over 300 stakeholders on how to organize and activate the playbook. And quite a few of these folks who've been trained have gone through a 48-hour boot camp on how to really dive into the fundamentals of organizing. And then we co-launched the Early Childhood Power and Policy Action Group with the Alliance and Kids Win Missouri to ensure we have ongoing coalition building so that we can achieve policy change and increase funding. Under governance and coordination, the first call to action in the playbook in that section is to form a regional coordinating entity. So now the Gateway Early Childhood Alliance exists, and they are doing coordination all across the region to ensure that early childhood is getting advanced in a more equitable way. And right now we're actually part of and leading ARPA demands campaign. And that campaign is an effort to win about 20 million to fund two programs that show that two programs that increase worker wages and provide more opportunities for educators to continue their education. So assuming that gets won, that could support thousands of childcare workers in the city and in the county. I'm going to skip this for sake of time. So the role of data, we believe that we must measure two things: a shift in life outcomes in the spirit of how FTF defines racial equity, and a shift in power. We believe those are two things deeply interconnected. So our vision for data, part one, is that there is a community accessible dashboard that measures progress against the outcomes named in the playbook, especially measuring, are we growing the number of affordable, cost-effective seats in the early childhood system? And the second vision for data is that we have conceptualized and are now scaling it and validating it with the Brown School of Social Work, basically a tool called the Power Index to measure power. And our belief is that when we see an increase in power among marginalized communities, we will see an increase in the racial equity in whatever system is being worked to reimagine and redesign. So I will wrap up there, but my two closing calls to action is one, build power with us. There's two ways you can do that. Join the Early Childhood Power and Policy Action Group. We meet monthly. And then we actually have an action tomorrow where we need as many people as possible to testify in support of our ARPA calls to action to put money behind these two programs that can address the child care workforce crisis. And then the last one is read the playbook. And the guiding question as you read it is like, what data infrastructure needs to exist at the local, state, and federal levels to hold us all accountable for moving the needle for babies. Thank you all, and that's my time. I'm going to drop links to those calls to action in the chat right now.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And I've also dropped that question for later discussion in the chat that was on your last slide. Thank you so much. And that was incredible presentation. And I just feel like what an amazing group we have today. Thank you so much for all of your questions, and keep any comments or questions coming in the chat as we keep moving forward with our speakers. But I do see a quick comment in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and give voice to that, which is, I see two things so far. Transparency is critical, community access to data for accountability, adding the component of community understanding and community creating data sources and data stories is very important for power. So that's great. Thank you so much for that comment, and keep comments and questions coming, because after the speakers are done, we are going to turn this into a conversation, which we are really excited to have everyone here join in on. So next up, we have Sharita Love. Sharita is the founder and executive director of the Education Equity Center of St. Louis. Their mission is to build a coalition of anti-racist educators and students who lead the systems change needed for a fully equitable education system in the St. Louis region. So please join me in welcoming Sharita Love.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone on the call. And thank you to Jen Rose and the Social Policy Institute for inviting me to today's conversation. I also want to thank the co-panelists whose work and lived commitment to justice inspires me radically, I would say. Before sharing with you, I call in the ancestors who've laid the path for me and the gifts I bring to bear, who lead and guide me in my work. I honor the indigenous stewards of the land that we inhabit and call for healing and reparation to the tribes who were defrauded and forcibly removed from their lands. I call for that same healing and reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans whose unpaid labor built the lands in which we inhabit. So be it, see to it. As shared, my name is Sharita Love, the Executive Director of the Education Equity Center. And as we continue to explore and discuss how we are currently and continuing our work to engage community and to mobilize data to advocate for change, I'd like to ground us in the following Jason Reynolds quote. And I'll read that quote into the room. Next slide, Jen Rose. We can't attack a thing we don't know. That's dangerous and foolish. It would be like trying to chop down a tree from the top of it. If we understand how the tree works, how the trunk and roots are where the power lies, and how gravity is on our side, we can attack it, each of us, with small axes, and change the face of the forest. We can attack it, each of us, with small axes, and change the face of the forest. This quote reminds me, it reminds us that we must know before doing. And as Karishma has brought into the room, as Charlie has brought into the room, we have to know and understand the gravity of history, the lived experiences, the stories, the laws, the policies, and the systems that create what we see as the forest. And know that it's dangerous if we don't do that. And in knowing we can make the proper assessments, use the proper tools and supports to change the face of the forest, each of us in our lives and in our institutional roles. And so our work, I'll get into that a bit. Our work at the Education Equity Center is actually in its second iteration as we began as a program of a global nonprofit organization in 2018. Following nearly a year of research, of grounding our work in a lot of what you heard today, some of the data and reports created by the data-rich institutions that we have in St. Louis, after community listening sessions and one-on-ones and forums held with impacted communities and educational stakeholders who shaped EdHub STL into what it needed to be for them, right? And what made sense for them. EdHub was also inspired by the Ferguson Commission report and the Youth at the Center call to action, which urged St. Louis to create an innovative education hub that was capable of building an inclusive, collaborative, and multidisciplined education environment focused on leading our region into the 21st century from early childhood to post-secondary. And that center's hub was to focus on creatively solving our region's most entrenched educational issues giving special considerations to innovations that address systemic challenges and racial inequity in education. And so for 2 years, EdHub created space for conversation, for community and coalition building that laid the foundation for anti-racist practices as they had not been discussed in the region previously. Thousands of educators and business leaders, parents, students, and education-focused philanthropists engaged and partnered as a result of EdHub setting the table. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, not only did it provoke us, but it provoked every institution, every person to rethink its assumptions and to create some room for a different type of transformation. And so that space that we created for collaboration, for learning, and different approaches and conversations to racial equity in education had never been so critical. And so in response to both the pandemic and the changes in St. Louis's educational landscape, we were called really by the community to think about new ways to continue to build on our momentum and further accelerate the impact that we were able to have in the years to follow. And so just as we did before launching EdHub, we went back to the community of partners that we held and had, listened deeply, both to partners of our work and also to critics of our work to help us think about what could be more expansive and what was needed. And so the decision was made for us to launch as an independent nonprofit, which brings in this iteration of our work, the Education Equity Center. And with that, as Jen Rose shared, our focus is explicitly on building a coalition of anti-racist educators and students who are leading the systemic changes necessary for a fully equitable education system in our region. And we center 4 specific action areas, as you see here. One being build the anti-racist teaching capacity of educators in St. Louis. The second, to elevate the autonomy of youth voice and power through anti-racist education capacity building. To activate those educators and students towards systems level leadership and change. And the fourth, which I'll talk a bit more for our purpose today, account to education data with a regional approach. And so as Karishma and Charlie named and shared, data with community voice has been at the center of the connective work that binds our individual work and space. And as I shared, we didn't simply launch EdHub or even the Equity Center because we thought we had the most best and brilliant idea. It was done, one, because of what had afore been laid in response both to understanding inequity in the space of education in St. Louis and from the work and research that had been done by our institution. I'll mute Oliver. There we go. There we go. And so I wanted to underscore the fact and the point that this work was done and continues to be done in partnership with as many as those affected by and drive the work such that it's intended for it's created for its intended purpose for and by the people. And so I just want to just call to our remembrance. I think Jessica did a really good job summarizing in the chat what we've heard so far, but calling us even to remember what has been brought into the room so far by Charlie and Karishma. What are some of the themes that stick out from, one, us elevating the calls put forward by the Ferguson Commission report, the ways that the data drove and continues to drive the ways that we partner with community to elevate both the need for our work and the ways that we shift power using research and data. And so one thing I must underscore, and again, what Karishma pointed us to at the start of our time today, is the fact that data is not black and white. And so if we want to tackle problems, we know we can't tackle them without engaging the community and centering the stories of the community. And so you'll see on the slide here the ways that we approach, as we are not an institution that focuses necessarily on creating reports or creating calls to actions based on any type of report that we have done. We center and leverage both what schools are seeing and experiencing as outcomes, particularly for their Black and Brown students. And then again, marrying that with the research and the data that has been pulled by data-rich institutions in St. Louis to say, how do we center that information? How do we center that data and shift towards a regional approach to shifting the conditions that are named in those reports, that are named in what we see in schools and in districts that are affecting Black and Brown students. And so again, back to this notion of the story behind the number. Data not being black and white, that there are people and histories that looking at numbers on a spreadsheet or report can't do full justice to name. We often like to think about data being scientific and being those hard numbers and measure calculations. But what happens when our data is about people? And, have we considered the human experience in our data understanding, knowing that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And so I want to close with this slide and invite you to take in this image, and I'll have a few things for call to action. If you just want to take in and think about this for yourself, or even drop any reflections in the chat, we think about continued advocacy and our work, particularly in the space of education. What related to this image comes up for you? What and who do you see? How does the message on the screen in the image land on you? How does it speak to the need of continued advocacy toward change? If you share that in the chat, that would be great, or even think about that in a reflection for yourself. What I see and would share in this image is a community of concerned and committed stakeholders. I see a research leader amongst a room of research leaders whose work centers the lived experience of Black children in particular. There's a space to convene, to come together, to grapple. And there's a call to action on the screen for us to collectively work to change education to something that works for all of us. And what else? I'm sure that there's more that you might name, that you might see in this picture of folks who are working to advocate for systemic change, knowing that this work is active, that as Karishma and Charlie spoke to, an education system that is doing exactly what it was intended to do and what it was intended and designed for is working for that purpose. And so what is our active purpose in both reimagining and shifting power such that education begins to work for all of us? And so the call to action that I invite us to think about, I'm going to drop that in the chat, in our continued collective data and advocacy efforts for those of us on this call, those of us on this panel, is to ensure that when we're working in this data space, when we're working in this advocacy space, that we are designing and leading with a lived experience that informs our movements, that we're creating infrastructure for proximity between people with lived experience and the decision makers, and that we're codifying policy and practice and advocacy that shift the ways that both policies and laws are made, how they're carried out, and how they are enforced. I again thank you for setting the table for this conversation and for having me today.
Thank you so much, Sharita. That was very powerful. And I just noticed that there are some people in the chat who are saying some things, and I just want to open up the space for a moment. I'm going to stop share in order to give space if anybody wants to come off mute and share. There are some folks in the chat that may prefer to stay in the chat, and that's fine as well. But I just wanted to give an opportunity if anybody wanted to speak into the space.
Yes, my name is Tamar Brown, and I want to thank all the speakers for the information that they shared in the space. I was invited by Joy to this space, and I'm so happy to be here. I learned so much from everyone, and I'm hoping to meet with each of the speakers to learn more about how a Red Circle, who I work for, can do some of the great things that you all have done and are doing in North County. Gives me much to think about and how to take that data and use it to tell the story of the spaces and the children that we work for, because education is not, is failing our children, and we have to do something different to ensure that they have an equitable opportunity for success, whatever their success looks like.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We do have one more speaker, but I just want to leave another moment if anybody else wants to jump in and share a comment or a question.
I guess I want to think through, are we, the people in this space, are we saying that we are different and sort of set apart from the lived experience people? Because I mean, my kids go to possibly a technically failing neighborhood school, and it feels, it's their lived experience. I get it secondhand, but it's real weird to say we need to hear from the lived experience people like we're different from them. I found that troubling.
Whose voice was that? What's your name?
Emily Hubbard.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for that reflection. I'll share, and of course, Karishma, Charlie, if you want to add, anything, of course. Yeah, so I'm speaking in my I voice and in sharing this. When I talk about impacted communities, and when I talk about hearing from and centering the lived experiences by those most impacted, I'm explicitly naming historical, racist policy, practice, procedure, infrastructure, all the systems that marginalize or push to the edge the voices and the lived experiences of those communities, particularly Black communities and communities of people known as people of color. And to say we are separate in our human experience, absolutely not. Like we are, yes, we center this and bring in the fullness of all human experience. And we specify that often left out of our conversations when we talk about data, when we center data, when we're doing research and study and implementing data, it is those voices of those most impacted who are left out of, they might be studied, right, and talked about in that data, but where are they present and where are they partnered with and where are they authentically heard in their shared and lived experience? That is what I mean when I talk about when I say that terminology. So I hope that clarifies and make clear.
I echo everything that Sharita said, or I love to call her Dr. Love. I heard you speak or mention a few times neighborhood-based schools, and I deeply believe in the concept of localizing an educational experience as much as possible. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about like what is a new definition of neighborhood schools, and especially given the fact that the most marginalized families are the most transient. And so I think it's hard for us to solve for neighborhood schools if we aren't addressing the fact that a lot of our most marginalized families don't get the privilege of staying in a same place for their K through 12 journey. And so we don't get the privilege to like be nostalgic about something that may not work for kids. I do think there's an opportunity for us to think about like, how do we make sure that every school in every zip code is a place that families can call home, whether they live in West St. Louis City in October, or North St. Louis City in November, or South St. Louis City in December. So I just think it's hard for us to solve for something if we don't understand the root causes of it. And then it's hard to solve for something if we aren't really centering the experiences of marginalized folks. And I'm curious about what are marginalized folks saying about the need and urgency of a neighborhood school? Is that important to them, or is that important to us?
And just a quick addition, want to plus one what Sharita and Charlie have said, and add from a data practitioner perspective. I think I personally have oftentimes had to compartmentalize my work self, the data practitioner self, from my lived experience. Now I'm a mom of two, a brown Indian woman, fairly early on in her career, as a means of making all the things go. And it can be difficult, I think, to find a way to braid all of those things together. And I hear in some of your comment, Emily, a call to us all as data practitioners to think about how our own personal lived experiences come to bear on the work that we do in data spaces, which I think is an important challenge to us all, one that I'm continually working at myself.
Thank you so much for the question, and for all of you all for chiming in. And hopefully we'll be able to talk some more after our last speaker. So I just really appreciate Sharita, your presentation and keeping the conversation going. And I just want to move to the last speaker before we go into a group discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. Joy joins us from West County Community Action Network, known as We Can. She co-leads the We Can team that works to address racial disparities in school discipline in West County schools. So please welcome Joy Wiesmall.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll get this set up. All right, there we are. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be among this group of women. I appreciated Sharita's last slide because it brought back a memory for me. If the photographer had been 3 feet back, my head would have been clear on the left. And I recognized a couple of other heads from our weekend group, and I just kind of want to raise up how sometimes it can, and especially I think when we talk about data, we sometimes feel ourselves siloed, and that is a problem and can be a problem. But I also want to recognize how often we're collaborating and communicating. And sometimes I think from the outside, we don't always know how much of that is going on, how many meetings are happening between people. And so I just wanted to appreciate all the resources that I have been given by Charlie and Karishma and Sharita, and in ways that wouldn't have been visible to the outside world, but have contributed to the work that West County Community Action Network is able to do. So with that, I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction. These are photos of WeCan's longest running and most visible activity. We will observe our 8th anniversary of weekly Black Lives Matter vigils next month. Our vigils began in the fall of 2014 in front of Chesterfield Commons, the longest strip mall in America. The vigils answered a call from Ferguson protesters to take the message of Black Lives Matter out to white-dominated West County. The original plan was to stand vigil each Saturday during the Christmas shopping season, but when we got to January, we didn't feel done. 8 years later, we still don't feel done. Data tells us that Black lives matter less than white lives in our country and in our region, starting with infant mortality and going through to life expectancy with many points in between. Every Saturday from 11:30 to 12:30, we hold a vigil at one of 5 sites in West County to stand in solidarity for justice and equity. As we completed our first year of vigils, our community felt strong enough to take other actions. At about that time, the Ferguson Commission released its report, Forward Through Ferguson. We combed through the calls to action and focused in on this one: eliminate the option for out-of-school suspensions and expulsions for students in kindergarten through 3rd grade. This was in the Youth at the Center section of the report, and it was in a subsection called Reforming School Discipline. To us, a bunch of amateurs, this call was the only one that we fully understood. We've learned a lot since then, but at the time, a lot of the education words and jargon didn't make sense to us, but we got this one. This was clear, and it also felt like low-hanging fruit. We thought, hey, we should be able to get rid of suspensions for the youngest students. That doesn't make sense anyway. We were even questioning, I wonder if that is happening at our schools. So we wanted to see if we can make that change in our communities. And about the same time, we got some data to help us make this case. The We Live Here podcast published a map of disparity indexes in suspensions between Black students and white students. The darker red districts are the ones with the greater disparities. The districts that suspend their Black students at a higher rate than their white students. The big red blob at the bottom left is Rockwood. The slightly less red district to the right of that is Parkway. Kirkwood is the same color and neighbors Parkway. Pattonville is the orange district northeast of Parkway. And in case we have people on the call who aren't in the St. Louis region, here I'll tell you some things that all of us in the St. Louis region know about that. So Rockwood and Parkway are are 2 of our largest districts in our area. They're white dominated, well-resourced school districts. Kirkwood is smaller and also white dominated and also well-resourced. Pattonville is one of our most diverse school districts in the whole region and somewhat less well-resourced. And so as we examined this map, we realized that we had residents of these 4 districts sitting at the table. So that's why our initial attempts were made in those 4 districts. Our first action was to make public statements at the school board meetings. I'm actually going to go back a slide, I think. Figure out how to do that. Whoops. Our first action was to make public statements at the school board meetings of each district, expressing dismay at the disparities shown by this data and suggesting that an initial partial solution would be to answer the call to action from Forward Through Ferguson and eliminate suspensions for kindergarten through 3rd grade. We naively assumed that all we had to do was ask. When none of the districts immediately changed their policies, we joined a coalition of organizations called Keep Kids in Class to work with all the school districts for a regional school assembly. That event happened in November 2016. A handful of school districts pledged to lead the way and to change their policies to eliminate suspensions for their youngest students. Most districts, including a couple of the ones that we worked with, pledged to look into the matter. The other two districts that we were working with showed up kind of just to see what was happening, but didn't make any official pledge. The public statements and the regional school assembly brought us to the attention of school administrators. So we went from being people who just showed up in front of school boards and made statements and began to be people who could talk to our superintendents because they understood who we were and that we weren't apparently going away very fast. And so we decided we would try asking for data from the school districts. And since the We Live Here map looked at all grade levels, and we were focusing in here on kindergarten through 3rd grade, we asked one of our districts, okay, what's your suspension data look like in kindergarten through 3rd grade so we can better understand this problem? And our first attempt was very discouraging. We got a ream of paper and columns of numbers. And even when we really tried to work hard to carefully examine this, there was no illuminating information that would come out of it. So clearly the goal of that school district at that time was to use data to obfuscate. We were luckier with our second attempt, partly because we were more careful about how we phrase our request, and partly because we worked with a school board member and a superintendent who expressed an interest in learning the same thing that we wanted to know. That district had never looked at discipline data disaggregated both by race and grade level. And when they pulled the data, we learned two things. One, that the problem was small. Only about 20 children in the lower grades had been suspended in the previous year. And two, that the problem was racist. Black students were suspended disproportionately given their representation in the district. That newfound awareness led to immediate changes in practice, and it informed the process for rewriting the discipline policy a year or so later in a way that eliminated the option of suspension for elementary school students, kindergarten through 5th grade, except for a couple of infractions where suspensions are required under the Missouri Safe Schools Act. Given that experience, we've changed our ask. We believe all the school districts that we work in, and others as well, could eliminate suspensions in their elementary schools, not just kindergarten through 3rd grade. They can do it from kindergarten through 5th grade. Unfortunately, we didn't get much traction at changing policy in the other school districts that we've been working with. And so then Forward Through Ferguson put out the Falling Through the Cracks report, and that gave us data and impetus to take another stab at this issue. This report did a risk assessment of St. Louis area school districts, comparing subgroups of students to the subgroup that is least likely to be suspended, white girls without a disability. The results were alarming. This slide shows the results for the whole region, but the data was also reported district by district, and some of the districts that we were working in looked worse than this, that having one or both of these differences from being a white female without a disability raised the risk of suspension so high. The Falling Through the Cracks report invited us to consider the intersectionality of race and disability. So we added the special school district, which provides services to students with disabilities in St. Louis County, to our list of districts where we make public statements to school boards. By this time, we'd also added another tactic to our work. We recruit volunteers to speak to candidates while they're running for school board. Our goal isn't to find the best racial equity candidates. Our goal is to make every candidate a better racial equity candidate. That way, the people who are elected are more prepared to understand and respond to equity issues on day one of their service to school board. This tactic also means that we develop relationships with school board members from the beginning, which is helpful when new issues arise. The Falling Through the Cracks report helped us deepen our conversation with school board candidates by providing understandable data for each school district. Here's our goal, as expressed by Forward Through Ferguson. Racial equity is a state in which race no longer predicts outcomes. In our work with suspensions, that would look like seeing discipline data disaggregated by race and not be able to tell which bar indicates Black students and which bar indicates white students without reading the labels. One thing that has changed since we've been doing this work is that at least some of our districts report this data, the suspension data, publicly to their school boards. But we need to monitor complacency. I've been to a lot of school board meetings now, and I've seen the reports. I mean, schools have been reporting what they usually call achievement gap or opportunity gap data for years now. And sometimes you'll see that report will come out almost like a weather report, as if the school district can't do anything about it. So we want to see these reports about equity accompanied by a plan for action. It's not enough to just see the report. We have to see action. WeCan's current project is to plan a training session in November for volunteers to speak to school board candidates in the 2023 election, which will be in April. We'll begin those conversations in January, because the candidates will have signed up by that time. We know that our volunteers prefer to have solid data in their hands when they speak to candidates. So we're currently gathering suspension data from our school districts, either by locating their most recent public report or requesting the information directly. Here's how data improves our grassroots organizing work. Data is what got us started. Numbers have a reputation for being cut and dried, but we found that when data shows injustice, that evokes emotion in people. When people are sad and angry about injustice that's perpetuated with our tax dollars and done in our names, we get motivated to take action. Of course, it takes more than being angry and sad to get people off Facebook and into streets and meeting rooms. Data serves as ammunition. Nearly all of us are nervous before we make our first public statement to a school board meeting. Being armed with data is one thing that gives people courage to do that. The good news is that doing it once proves to people that it's not that hard. And in fact, it causes quite a natural high to stand for justice in a visible and effective way. Engaging in conversation with a school board candidate takes a different kind of courage. The goal is to educate candidates about racial equities in their district. To do that, we want to feel confident about our own understanding. Data makes us sound smart. Since WeCan doesn't have the capacity to gather data ourselves, this is where coalition building and collaboration shine. The West County Community Action Network is grateful to the We Live Here podcast, to Forward Through Ferguson, and to our school districts for providing data. Data doesn't have power without activists pushing it, and activists don't have a firm grounding without data. Grassroots organizations like ours rely on data to move people to act. So thank you, Jen Rose. I'll let you negotiate how we do this next transition into the next part.
Thank you so much, Joy. That was really helpful. And I just want to take a moment to say, to thank all of our speakers, and to thank Karishma for helping to think about the group of speakers that would really do a great job in this space, because you were obviously 100% on target. These were all excellent. And it's great to see how the different pieces that each of you is working on and how it's all come to be. So I do want to do one last plug in the chat about completing our survey. If you like what the presenters have had to say today, please click on that and have it open so that you can share your thoughts. And I want to move it over into a conversation. So I do see that we already have a hand up. So I'll just start there and let Corey come off mute and say what you got to say.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jen Rose. And thank you to all of you. Appreciate your sharing and insights and helping to frame a different kind of touch with how to frame data and its utility. Joy's presentation made me think most deeply about, raised the consideration, but I think I am interested in hearing any of you who have a response. Were there any kinds of capacity building activities or linkages that you utilize or utilized in projects where you were allowing, there was a level of data literacy, whether that's numerical or in the storytelling? What ways did you prepare folks to engage in that? Thanks.
So we hold we're getting better at this, but we hold events to organize people, especially during the school board election season. And that will often include, we are all amateurs at this grassroots level here. And so it will often include muddling together ourselves to try to figure out how to use the data that we have on hand. And so, yeah, so I'll let someone else answer.
I can jump in as well. I think that's a great question, Corey, and gets back to the idea that putting a number out into the world is not enough to ensure that the number does any sort of good. And so when we come at that question at FTF, it gets back to thinking about who our different audiences are and what their orientations to and facility with data might be, and trying to make sure that there's some option for any given audience member, regardless of what their appetites might be. So we'll have I'm actually picturing this tool in my head that I guess I could share out loud. We think about almost like an iceberg, to not confuse with the iceberg analogy that was so effectively used earlier by Charlie. But if we've got some individuals who have a great deal of appetite for data and for wonk, we think about how we can provide the raw data or the relative risks, the like nitty gritty data. As we move up though, to people who are a little bit interested in the wonk, a little bit interested in that depth, but want to stay a little bit more service level, we might think of these as like the NPR crowd to contrast with like the C-SPAN crowd in that more nitty-gritty space. For the NPR crowd, we might have the report that engages in a longer conversation, but isn't trying to give individual numbers at a district level or school district level, what have you. Then still up from there, we think about the MSNBC level, blog posts, things that really crystallize the key messages in a fewer number of words, using infographics, using some data stories, and then at the very top, almost like a BuzzFeed level, are just the social media snippets that highlight just the headlines. And so I think by putting together almost like a portfolio or a full slate of different ways in which we're communicating our findings, we're trying to anticipate what level of awareness, what level of familiarity and comfort with numbers people might have, and provide them with something that'll meet them where they are and still move them a bit in the direction we want them to go.
And Karishma and a couple of her partners came to a weekend meeting and presented us, I'd say, about the MSNBC level, but very focused on the districts that we were working in, and had people in the room who were in those districts and could speak at those school board meetings.
And just to follow up on that great question, if any of the presenters, or frankly, anyone in this space right now, have resources or tools that they have found useful for engaging different audiences with data in order to advocate for change, please share those either in the chat or with me afterwards when we send our follow-up email. Any resources that have been mentioned here, we will make sure that we share back out with you. So with that, does anyone else want to either jump in on that question or ask another one?
I'll just jump in and add briefly. Just for us in our work, it's capacity building is pretty contextual. So if we're working with a school or a district where we are centering and elevating the ways in which, you know, outcomes and data are telling a story about particularly Black and Brown students in their system. For us, it's about the transparency, building capacity around transparency, centering that data, marrying that with historical implications that have gotten us to this point where we do see these particular outcomes. And so that's pretty much the context if we're working, or context when we're working with school or district partners, or even education-focused organizations that center education data in the ways that they approach their mission and work. And then, you know, if we're working more community focused to elevate, let's say, you know, a still separate, still unequal report, it's the ways that we marry this concept of we don't have to be so insular, and we build capacity around, we don't have to be so insular around what the data is. Like, these are transparent facts that we all have to grapple with and build our capacity to have more transparent conversations about that. And so that's our approach.
Thanks so much. And I see a couple of questions in the chat. So I'll just shout out one of them. For We Can, do you anticipate the interventions will positively impact restraint practices and or the use of corporal punishment?
Yeah, and actually the next question that Carol Brown asked is, have there been conversations on types of services? And that's related. So she asked, provided to students who might otherwise have been suspended K3 or K5. So that reforming school discipline page from the Ferguson Commission report had a number of other things that would be, it's not so much a substitution for suspension as what practices can we put in place so that so that the behaviors don't even surface to the point that you would want to suspend students. And so those kinds of services that we now understand better are restorative practices, trauma-informed care, also looking at anti-bias, anti-racism work. And so getting those kinds of services to students and educators, then all of that would not only reduce out of school suspension, but would also positively impact the restraint practices and or use of corporal punishment, which doesn't happen in any of our school districts. That, although that's been a useful example for me, is that the school districts we work in have a one sentence policy against corporal punishment. Basically, we don't do this. We have yet to have a school district be willing to have a one sentence, we don't suspend kindergarten through 3rd grade or kindergarten through 5th grade. They'll do a complicated rewrite of their discipline policy where that might be the result, but they won't do one sentence of we don't suspend little kids like they will do one sentence of we don't hit kids. And I'm kind of curious how if there's anything to be learned from how that transition happened, because corporal punishment was used when I was a kid. And so somewhere in this 40, 50 years, there has been a transition. If that change can be made, why can't we make this change for suspension too?
That is an excellent point. Any other questions that folks want to come off mute or throw in the chat?
This is Emily Hubbard again. I have a question for Karishma. I saw the Still Separate, Still Unequal report and thought it was really effective at showing how districts are underfunded, or, you know, property tax just makes everything unfair. But I was wondering if you've seen any results from, you know, positive results from that. I know when I saw it, I was like, oh, well, the rich white county districts should be giving some of that property tax money to, you know, the North City and St. Louis public schools. And every time I say that, people are like, well, you're crazy. But what have y'all seen from the work that you've done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And well, I think your anecdote at the end there was a little bit jokey in that, like, it sounds like that that assertion that you're making is not being received well. I think that there are parts of the community where that conversation is happening more seriously, because it's not that outlandish that we adopt a model of collecting and distributing property taxes at the local level that is more equitable. It has been done in several other parts of the country, and in a place that's as municipally fragmented as ours, I think it makes a ton of sense for us to be distributing across the county as opposed to collecting and then distributing taxes within district boundaries. And so I think the answer, the somewhat unsatisfying, but I think ultimately more sustainable answer to your question is that there are no easy solutions, right? We're talking about reforming. If we want to acknowledge that the diagnosis here is systemically flawed, structurally racist education systems, then the treatment needs to be reforming those structures and those systems, which is slow work. It's hard work because it literally means redistributing resources, and that tends to be uncomfortable and something that those who are benefited by the current system will fight. So the work that we're seeing happening now, the progress that we are seeing now is in the coalitional space, the organizing efforts to collectively push to make some of those systems changes possible. So that looks like learning from how past efforts to do that have been successful. So in the early aughts, we saw court cases at the state Supreme Court level that were successful in reforming the state funding formula for education. And that was an in-state, out-state collaboration of I want to say dozens, if not a couple hundred school districts across the state coming together to call for the improvement of the funding formula. So what can we learn from them? How can we build relationships with districts within St. Louis and outside of St. Louis? There are some school districts, including some that are benefiting from the current system, who recognize that the current system is not fair and that that the wealth of resources that they have is not just and are at that table. And so part of my answer is encouragement to you to find those places where the recommendation, the realization that you have is acknowledged by others, because I think there's community that you can tap into. And I can share with Genro some ways of getting involved with FTF's work in that space, and Sharita's work and the Equity Center and Charlie, and we're all sort of plugged into various places where these types of ed transformation conversations are happening. But it's going to be, I think, a lot of that process victory that we're looking at for a while before we see the ultimate outcome that we're looking for. But process counts. Process matters a lot.
Thanks so
you.
much. And I noticed a couple of other comments in the chat. Does anyone want to come off mute with those? Or if not, I'm happy to shout them out, but I want to give you the space if you would like to.
I'm just reading through them. I'm seeing Rebecca, does the safe school law need to be adjusted to protect the youngest students from expulsions and out of school suspension? I think that's part of it. Right now, safe school violations mean that if schools are getting certain types of federal funding, they have to suspend and expel students if they bring certain types of weapons, which can be very broadly defined, onto campus or engage in certain types of activities. And that is, I think, at least part of the answer to the question that you posed, Joy, about why we can't make it as simple as we don't suspend these little kids. Now, the way we've seen that safe schools violation piece used to kick kids out of class is, I think, far beyond the pale in a lot of instances. You hear the stories of kids that, bit a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun or something, and that was enough to get them suspended or from school. So we're definitely seeing some misuses of that. So there's a lot to unpack.
I see Corey is raising their hand. Go ahead. You're on mute if you're talking.
I was going 1,000 miles a minute. Sorry. To Sharita's response, and it kind of nudged me in a way because I really appreciated your discussion around capacity building, nicely integrated beyond just skill-based kind of capacity building, but kind of like what to do with, like just a kind of a more effective kind of capacity building space, right? That's as important. But all of that to say that I wonder if you all ever, or how do you handle, if it comes up for you, the tension around that's related for me that I experience, this commitment to outcomes and seeing things materially be different. But one of the definitions of equity that I really appreciate is that it is the elimination, which speaks to process, right? And so there is a certain value that's relevant and significant and transformative in us getting to, the equity indicator. So I just was wondering how do you all kind of live through that and work around that?
I'll share. Thanks for that, Corey. And I was about to put a comment in the chat that you better enunciate equity indicator. I like that. Better enunciate.
That's how it annoys me.
The first thing I thought about, when you said that and when you were posing that, is one thing that in the slowing of our work, and this hopefully this makes sense to folks. In the slowing of our work, and I'm speaking about the Equity Center as anti-racist practitioners who are focused on long-term systemic change that I believe you're speaking to, is the ability for us to articulate the ways in which we partner and the ways in which we do not. The ways in which we center this work as a practice, that it is not a checklist, right? That it is not, as hard as it is to fathom, that it's not going to be easily categorized with those objectives and measures that often are so most important, particularly the funders, and right, to be able to describe who you are, what you do, how you're showing in it, and to illustrate its effectiveness. And coming back to this point of, if we are committed to the long-term systemic practices that are necessary in anti-racist work, and our work in the ways that we partner, we are very clear up front about what those values look like and what they mean to us, and that we will name and call you in when some of our socialization shows up in our relationship, and some of the ways that our socialization might be impeding the ways that we're able to partner in practice, right? And so that has been a way of us slowing down this urgency way of being and thinking around, like, we gotta do this, we gotta do this. And there is urgency, right? There are some things that are life and death, right, that are happening in our communities with our babies, etc. So there's certainly urgency, and multiple things can be true at one time. We can hold multiple truths at one time, and address our urgent needs while practicing what is needed to keep us and sustain us in this work for future generations and for what is necessary for us to continue.
Yeah, thank you for that question and that answer. Someone else jumping in?
I hesitate to say anything because that was just so beautifully said. But I just want to hit on the importance that a group of data-oriented data practitioner folks like us is asking that question, because I think so often we are called on to speak to the outcome, the thing like that we're ultimately trying to move the needle towards. And while that is, yes, our job, I think it is also our job to say like, and let's look for the ways in which we're measuring the process and that we're giving value to the process. And let's push back a little bit on the idea that if we can measure it, it's important. If we can't measure it, it's not important. To summarize something that you said earlier, I think, Sharita, and really push our boundaries to accept that complexity and yeah, hold multiple truths at once. Yeah, I can't say it any better than Sharita. Should stop trying.
And I just quickly, we're almost at the end of our time, but I just quickly want to raise up Charlie's question from earlier and kind of put it in conversation with this, which is what data infrastructure needs to exist at the local, state, and federal levels. Oftentimes when we think about data and data infrastructure, we think about, like someone mentioned earlier, quantitative, what can be measured. And in all of these conversations, really spurred on by Karishma and our other members of our advisory committee and a lot of the presenters at this series, is that we need to think much bigger and more broadly about what does that mean? It is not just about what data we have, it's about what processes are in place, what types of relationships are being built, and thinking in that broad way. So I appreciate that all the speakers here today really do that and model that in your work. That sort of big picture way of thinking about those questions instead of just like, what numbers do we need, which isn't the point, though it is important. So really appreciate that. Any last questions, comments, insights before we close? I really appreciate this conversation so much. I feel like honored to be in the presence of so many amazing speakers and thinkers.
I would say to you, I told Dan, we were just direct messaging, let me come on camera to say this. I think this is probably one of the most spiritual data conversations I've had in a while. And they should be, right? Or they can be, rather, I should say. So I think you did a great job at pulling this particular team together, and just appreciate you and looking forward to doing more work and transforming even the notions around data toward justice is really, really exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Corey. That reminder that data nerds have hearts
And souls.
and souls.
Yeah. Whew. Well, since we are pretty much at the end of our time, I just one more time want to thank all of the presenters and just everyone who took the time. I know there's so much going on. There's so many places you could be, and for this many people staying to the end of the event is pretty amazing. I'm just going to one last time plug into the chat. Our Data is for Everyone, Data Science for Social Impact Summit, because that is another place to continue the conversation. And we're trying to think about the next phase of these conversations and really don't want to just end with the events, but want to really use them to jump into some ways to roll up our sleeves and apply some of these things, which you all are already doing. And it's amazing to hear. So thank you so much. And we will be following up with resources and more information in our follow-up email.